Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, in the beginning, yeah, in the
Listen properly.
in the beginning, yeah, in the beginning, in the beginning, in the beginning.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Hollow Knight starts with bugs. They're not special, and since bugs in this world are analogous with humans, we start all the way back with Cro-Magnon bugs. There were some anomalies, but by and large, bugs lacked intellect. Enter the Radiance, patron god of the Moth tribe and residing god of dreams.
English, motherfucker! Do you speak it?
So what was the Radiance doing in the beginning of the story, you might ask? Well, we do know that she occasionally threw hands with the local ferrofluid, but outside of that, there is not much information. Odds are she was just chasing the brightest light source she could find, hence why she will later be found hanging out in heaven. The point is, the beginning of the story of Hollow Knight wasn't particularly interesting, at least with regards to the region of interest, though there was an entire tribe of Moth Seers that was burst from the Radiance through unknown means, and that's all that really matters in this leg of the story. An unknown amount of time passed, and then we come across the next god of relevance, a worm, and I have to clarify that it is specifically spelled WYRM, because in accordance with fantasy terminology, that should mean that it is a dragonoid species, but in actuality it is just a dirt-burrowing Laffy Taffy. This worm was a higher being that showed up in the region to die. But not really, because worms get a free reincarnation as their racial trait. So the worm crawled into a hole, died, and was reborn into a being known as the Pale King. Spoilers, he fucks everything up. The Pale King created a kingdom known as Hollow Nest, because apparently that is a racial tendency that they have. And worms don't create any old kingdoms. The kingdoms they create give a +10 buff to intellect and sentience. So almost all of the bugs in Hollow Nest gained higher intellect and started doing real person things. Like scamming. Almost all because there are some gremlins that don't display sentience. So either they didn't get the buff, or their sentience stats were just unsalvageable to begin with. Despite all odds, the Pale King was incredibly charismatic. He managed to convince the Moth tribe to stop worshipping the Radiance and follow him instead. And since the Radiance was a dream god, the Moth tribe, forgetting about her, effectively killed her.
And anyway,
the Radiance
means just pretend. If she's pretend, how come you said you could see her? I lied.
She got the Coco treatment. An indeterminate amount of time passed, and the Pale King kept on expanding his kingdom. For a kingdom of bugs, it was incredibly technologically advanced, with sprawling transportation networks, a bustling economy, and towering spires of beautiful architecture. Not all of the native bugs entered into the Pale King's service, but most did. And the ones that didn't had agreements with the Pale King, in particular the mantises who bought their independence by murdering all the vermin that tried to climb out of Deep Nest. Of course, this is a Souls-inspired game, so it was about time for the apocalyptic event to make its rounds and devastate a once great civilization. It was time for Hector to be remembered. The particulars of how the Radiance survived being sent to the Shadow Realm are unclear. One of the most widely accepted interpretations is that even though the Moss tribe forsook the Radiance, her impact and presence could not be wholly eradicated, evident from the statue atop the Crystal Peaks. I prefer to think that the Seer in the game still remembered the Radiance, and that she, in particular, fucked everything up. But the important part is that the Radiance survived. Of course, she survived in the sense that she still existed in the dream world. Being that she is the god of dreams, we don't even know if she can manifest in the corporeal realm in the first place. But the Radiance had just survived an attempt on her life, and she wanted to exact vengeance, so she utilized her abilities as the god of dreams to the fullest. The Radiance began to manifest through the minds of the denizens of Hollownest. If this doesn't seem to follow a logical through line given the Radiance's status as the god of dreams, understandable. The thing is that in Hollow Knight, dreams and thoughts are intertwined. When you dream nail characters, you hear their thoughts rather than seeing what their minds conjured in REM's sleep, so the two are more or less interchangeable terms. As the Radiance manifested in the minds of bugs, they lost their sentience, lashing out at the other bugs of Hollownest. This could be due to the corrupted bugs' minds being connected to the Radiance in a hive mind system. Or it could be that the bugs were going back to how they were, before the Pale King's leadership aura. Of course, the Pale King wasn't a Siri crafter, and he really didn't care why his kingdom was collapsing. He just cared that it was. But still, to counteract a calamity, you still have to understand why it's occurring to some extent, if only to stop the problem at its source. The Pale King knew that the infection of the mind sprawling across his kingdom was the Radiance's handiwork, and he devised a solution. A solution that involved infanticide. If you recall, the Radiance in the beginning of the story occasionally threw hands with ferrofluid. That fluid was known as the Void, and had come to exist either concurrently or long before the Radiance. Void is inherently violent, lashing out at any nearby entity. Most importantly, the Void is not sentient. It's mostly a big ol' lake at the very bottom of Hollownest in the abyss. And this was a characteristic that the Pale King coveted so much. See, the Pale King knew that the Radiance was the god of dreams, so he reasoned that the only way to ensure the Radiance would never return was to seal her within a mind that had literally no thoughts, head empty. In his own words, no mind to think, no will to break, no voice to cry suffering. Now, how exactly did the Pale King go about creating this mindless, will-less, voiceless husk? Well, he already laid the groundworks for creating a void entity. The Pale King had been experimenting with imprinting his will onto the void, placing that void into a manufactured shell, and letting the void use the shell as a body. This is how he created his soldiers, the King's molds and Wings molds. So did the Pale King use this technique to create a void entity with which to seal the Radiance? You would think, but no. He got another higher being, the acorn tree called the White Lady, and they banged. A lot. and he took his newborn children and tossed them into the abyss, where, go figure, they all died, and the void seeped into these corpses and reanimated them, becoming vessels. The Pale King repeated this process so many times that the floor, background, and platforms found in the abyss are covered or entirely comprised of vessel masks. Now the Pale King had a lot of vessels, more than he knew what to do with. To be honest, it begs the question of why he made so many of them in the first place, but maybe he just really liked the trussy. Regardless, the Pale King had probably close to 1 million vessels just chilling down in the abyss, but he only really needed one to seal the Radiance. Because the Pale King was a believer in strawman Darwinism, and he wanted the most physically fit of his progeny to become the vessel for the Radiance, he hosted a platforming battle royale. The first to make it to the top wins and gets to seal the Radiance for all time. The losers just fester in the abyss for all time. In the end, one vessel was chosen, and the player character was not that chosen vessel. The chosen vessel was taken with the Pale King for training to become the titular Hollow Knight, and the player character, Chrising the Knight, fell back into the abyss. The Hollow Knight's training eventually concluded, and the Radiance was sealed within him. 3 powerful bugs called Dreamers entered permanent slumber, placing a seal over the Black Egg Temple in which the Hollow Knight was contained, acting as an extra layer of protection. 2 of these Dreamers were in service to the Pale King, and they did it for free. But the last one was the Queen of Deepnest, which took heavy inspiration from Team Cherry's homeland of Australia. The bugs of Deepnest were barbaric savages, so the Queen of Deepnest wanted a progeny with the Pale King to have the strengths of a higher being. And out popped Hornet, also called the Gendered Child. Why is Hornet called the Gendered Child? Easy answer is because she's canonically a female. The long answer is that she's called the Gendered Child in relation to her half-siblings, the Vessels, who are ungendered. Some, including Team Cherry, have gone on record saying that the Vessels, particularly the Knight, can serve as non-binary representation. Now, I don't have a degree in gender studies, but the reason that the Knight and Vessels are genderless is because they are literally corpses of children being puppeted by a symbiote-like liquid. But if you do want to consider the Vessels to be non-binary, be my guest. You have the blessing of God. Regardless, the Radiance was sealed, and Hollow Nest resumed its activities. For the most part, things went back to how they were before the Radiance popped back up. Since Hollow Knight doesn't have a timescale, another indeterminate amount of time passed, and unfortunately for the Pale King, he made the critical mistake of not understanding how void entities work. I said earlier that the Pale King's method for creating void entities was by imprinting will onto the void. Yeah, so the Radiance started leaking through again. Believe it or not, repeatedly telling the Hollow Knight to seal the Radiance to save Hollow Nest does in fact constitute a will. And where there's a will, there's Phanta-corruption. How did the Pale King try to circumvent the Radiance's return this time? He didn't. He packed his things, which constituted his literal entire palace, complete with retainers and buzzsaws, and dipped. In reality, he performed a mini Radiance procedure on his own palace, in the sense that he sealed his palace within the mind of a void entity and put a dream seal on top of said entity. Clearly he thought that the process could win a Nobel Prize, and the proof of concept was there. What's sealed will be accessible after an indeterminate amount of time. Oh.
Get what you fucking deserve!
Hollownest, without its beacon of light, its patron pale being, fell into disarray. The Radiance's infection continued to seep into the minds of bugs, causing chaos. And here is where the game of Hollow Knight actually begins, with the knight returning from wilds beyond, after having escaped the abyss through inexplicable means. On its journey, the knight runs into Hornet, whose current occupation is murdering anything that tries to break the Hollow Knight's seal, particularly vessels. As the story progresses, the knight meets the Seer, last moth of the Moth tribe, and receives the Dream Nail, allowing it to enter the dreamer's slumber and kill them, breaking the seals on the Black Egg Temple. Hornet begins to acknowledge the knight and sees potential to destroy the Radiance permanently. Hornet encourages the knight to return to the Abyss and relearn the tragedy of its conception. If the knight does not return to the Abyss, then once it has killed all the Dreamers, it can finally confront the Hollow Knight in the unsealed Black Egg Temple. By killing the Hollow Knight, the knight will have to take its place in containing the Radiance, and it will likely be unsuccessful in doing so. Should the knight return to the Abyss, it will gain the ability to unite the Void, integral in killing the Radiance. When arriving at the Black Egg Temple, Hornet will now be there to greet the knight and nudge the player towards using the Dream Nail to enter the Hollow Knight's mind. During the fight with the Hollow Knight, Hornet will pierce the Hollow Knight's mask, giving the knight ample time to use the Dream Nail. If the knight does not use the Dream Nail, then the story will pan out exactly as in the first ending, except Hornet will also be trapped in the Black Egg Temple as collateral. If the knight does use the Dream Nail, then it enters the Hollow Knight's mind, where the Radiance is being contained. As the fight progresses, the Void will begin to climb into the Dream World, and at the conclusion of the battle, the Hollow Knight holds the Radiance, while the knight deals the finishing blow, leaving the Radiance to be consumed by the Sea of Void. The Radiance is defeated, and the infection recedes from Hollownest. Hornet awakens in the Black Egg Temple, next to the knight's mask, which cracked when he summoned the Void. Now for the DLC story. Luckily, the Grimm Troupe is mostly self-contained. The Grimm Troupe is a circus led by the bug called Troopmaster Grimm, who takes the troupe to crumbling kingdoms in order to carry out the troupe's ritual. This is to satiate the Nightmare Heart, which is a higher being that presides over, you guessed it, nightmares. Unfortunately, the extent of the Nightmare Heart's power is unknown, given that it has very little screen time and doesn't really do much. At the conclusion of the ritual, the power of the Nightmare Heart is transferred from Grimm to his progeny, and the cycle continues. The knight is given the choice to either help the Nightmare Troupe to complete this ritual, or to banish the troupe. Neither choice impacts the mainline story. Godmaster, on the other hand, is far from self-contained. God-seekers are bugs from a faraway land that attune themselves to higher beings through ritual combat. One of these God-seekers makes their way into Hollownest, and the knight enters its mind in order to engage in said ritual combat. This allows the knight to fight foes it has previously fought at their peak performances, most notably the Pure Vessel, which is the Hollow Knight at its prime, long before the Radiance's corruption set in. As the combat continues, the God-seekers become more and more attuned to higher beings, culminating in summoning the Radiance itself, appearing in its prime as the Absolute Radiance. Eventually, the knight defeats the Absolute Radiance, and the Supreme Void Entity, known as the Lord Shade, appears to absolutely murk the Absolute Radiance, and it's a one-sided beatdown. There isn't a clear explanation of why the Lord Shade appeared. It could be that the knight's will grew to enough of an extent to unify enough of the Void and embody the Lord Shade, It could be that the Godseeker's attunement to higher beings brought forth the Lord Shade in the same way they brought out the Absolute Radiance. It could be that the Godseekers were unwittingly attuning with the night, which created the Lord Shade. Doesn't really matter, the point is that the Lord Shade manifested, and it rips out of the Godseeker's corporeal form into Hollownest. With the annihilation of the Absolute Radiance, the infection recedes, and the game ends with the Hollow Knight emerging from the Black Egg Temple. The fate of Hollownest is up in the air. This is a heavily watered down and comedy-oriented presentation of the Hollow Knight lore. If you actually want to learn about the in-depth lore of Hollow Knight and you haven't done so already, you should visit Mossbag instead.